Okay, so our talk tonight, our topic is matrimony, the sacrament of marriage, and we'll look at it in the Old and the New Testament. And so for the last 2 weeks, those of you who are here, we've been looking at the prophetic role exercised by Christ. And we've looked at Moses and Jesus as the new Moses. And last week we looked at the Trinity. So tonight we're going to come back down to earth a little more and look at matrimony as it's revealed in the Old and New Testaments. And since the family is the foundation of society, it's reasonable to expect that the sanctification of man brought about by the true religion would also imply a sanctification of marriage and family life. Right? And the true religion has to be one that sanctifies what is most fundamental to human life, and certainly marriage and the family is one of those things. And just as we've seen in the other talks in this series, we've seen a deep continuity between the Old Testament and the New, between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, on many different points. Well, here too, in terms of matrimony, we'll find a deep continuity, but at the same time, a fulfillment brought by Christ. And above all, the biblical revelation that man is made in God's image sheds light on the family and matrimony. And the coming of the Messiah and his paschal ministry brings that revelation to its fullness. And thus, it makes possible a greater revelation of God's plan for the family, and above all, the grace to put it into practice. Okay, so let's start by looking at the Old Testament on marriage. And here we can, there are four principal sources where we can find the teaching of the Old Testament on marriage. The first and most important is Genesis, the first 3 chapters of Genesis, the original creation of man. Secondly, we find teaching on marriage in the law, the precepts of the law of Moses, the written law, but also the oral law conserved by the rabbis. We also find teaching on marriage in the families given to us in the history of the Old Testament. We won't have time to look at that tonight. And then finally, the nature of marriage is revealed by the fact that God reveals that his relationship to Israel is that of a spousal union. He loves Israel with the love of a husband for his wife. Okay, so let's start with the first aspect, the revelation of the nature of marriage in the account of creation itself. And so it's very important that the institution of marriage is recounted right in the very narration of creation, because that shows us that marriage isn't something conventional. It isn't something that belongs to human society to legislate and to form as it wishes, because matrimony was instituted by God at the very moment that he created man. It springs from the very fact that God made man male and female to be in his image. Now we see this, the creation of man, in the first and second chapters of Genesis. And they're two parallel accounts of creation, and they're different and complementary. The first account gives us the 7 days, the work of the 6 days, and then the seventh day of rest. The second account presents us Adam in the garden. So we'll start with the first account. And at the end of the work of the 6 days, that whole work culminates in the creation of man in God's image. You know this, we've heard this many times. I'll just read it again, though. God said, "Let us make man in our image and likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps in the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it." And at the end of that work, God saw that his work was very good, and blessed it. And so the Jewish tradition recognizes in this text the first commandment of the Torah, to be fruitful and multiply. And so we see that God's, we could call it kingly work in creation. He's king of his creation. His kingly work culminates in the creation of man, who's called to participate in God's own creative activity by being fruitful and multiplying and subduing the earth. Right? So God creates man to continue the work of creation and to be a participant in its goodness. And that participation takes these two forms, procreating and educating children, and human work, subduing the earth. And so man's dignity of being made in God's image is precisely a dignity of being able to cooperate with the Creator in his own creative and kingly activity. And that means that marriage and family life, by which we cooperate with him more intimately than anything else, participates in being in God's image. And that means that human sexuality and marriage and family life isn't governed simply by instinct as in the other animals, but shares God's own governing power. So marriage and family life has to be transformed by that fact, by the fact that we're made in God's image and participants in his work. Right? And so human sexuality can never be reduced to something merely biological, right? Because it's intimately affected by being in God's image. And thus it's been given a spiritual vocation. And not just a spiritual vocation, but a kingly vocation to cooperate with God himself. And the text of Genesis seems to emphasize that connection between being made in God's image and human sexuality by emphasizing God. The text says, God made man in his image. In the image of God he made him. Male and female he made them. In other words, the text of Genesis connects our being in God's image with our being male and female. Right? And that shows us that matrimony is an essential part of our being made in God's image, or at least our vocation to matrimony. The second chapter of Genesis, the second account of creation, gives us more information still, a deeper vision. In the second account, we see that Adam is created alone first. He's put in the garden in solitude. And to remedy that solitude, God makes the animals and brings them to Adam for him to name them. And so Adam names the animals. He gave names to all the cattle, the birds of the air, every beast of the field. But for the man, there was not found a helper fit for him. Obviously, right? Adam didn't find among the cows and dogs and cats a helper fit for him. And so he finds himself in a kind of existential solitude that's not good for him. As God himself states, it is not good that man should be alone. Without another person to love, Adam's nature was frustrated. Right? Just as we experience in our own lives. That original solitude shows us that an awareness on man's part that he transcends the material universe. Even though he's part of it, we're part of it through our bodies, but we transcend it, and therefore we don't find a partner simply in the material world without the spiritual dimension. And so the text is very interesting because it shows us the first thing that Adam knew was other things that belong to material creation below him. And it was reflecting on that knowledge of the things outside of himself that he became aware of himself and became aware that he was alone. Lacking a companion, right, with which to share his internal experience. And so that brings us to the creation of Eve, who was made precisely to be a helper fit for him, a helper like unto him. And so the biblical text, it's chapter 2, verse 23, shows us the value of the creation of Eve, through the exalting of Adam. He says, "At last, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." And so Adam exalts, not just because he found in Eve another person, but because it was somehow an essential part of his being to have interpersonal communion with another person. He was radically incomplete, alone with the animals. John Paul II comes back to this again and again in all his works. In his first encyclical, he has a beautiful statement about that. He says, "Man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible to himself. His life is senseless if love isn't revealed to him." And that was Adam's experience in the garden. Now, the fact that Eve was created out of Adam's rib is mysterious, but significant. It's not simply a legend, right? Everything that we find in this account is incredibly profound and has a deep meaning. And so here, the fact that Eve is created from Adam's rib, on the one hand, it shows us the intimacy with which the man and the woman are to live side by side. She's bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, literally, and thus each one has to respect the other. And they're called to an intimacy of life and a complementarity. There's also a mystery in this, and we've seen this in earlier talks, that the fact that Eve is made out of Adam's side is a figure of Christ and the church. For on the cross, when Christ was dying on the cross, when he died, the centurion pierced his side to make sure that he was dead, and out flowed water and blood. And the fathers of the church see in that a figure, the water and the blood, of the two fundamental sacraments of the church: baptism, the gate, the origin of the other sacraments, and the Eucharist, the culmination of the sacraments. And the church is born of the sacraments, right? The church is born of baptism and the Eucharist. And so the fathers of the church see in that water and blood out of Christ's side the birth of the church, Christ's spouse, the new Eve, from his side, from his pierced side as he died, thus being prefigured in Eve being made out of Adam's side when he was asleep. Christ asleep in death, Adam asleep temporarily. The fact that, back to Adam, the fact that Adam exults at the creation of Eve shows us another fundamental aspect of the human person, our ability to respond to beauty, and especially the beauty of another person. And so Adam's joy at the creation of Eve is principally a joy at the opening of interpersonal communion and the release from solitude, and also the physical beauty of Adam's spouse and her spiritual beauty of being likewise made in God's image caused that exaltation. And beauty has the vocation of attracting us to goodness and to truth. And that's especially true in marriage, right? The beauty of our spouse, not just physical, but also spiritual, is given to us by God to help us to grow in appreciating the beauty of God. Right? So beauty, like love, serves as a kind of ladder by which we can ascend up to God. John Paul II, he returned to this chapter of Genesis again and again in his Wednesday audiences, which are gathered together in the work, The Theology of the Body. And he saw in this exaltation of Adam, at the creation of Eve, the sacrament, what he calls the sacramentality of the body. The fact that Eve, in her physical and spiritual nature, she served as a kind of sacrament, in other words, a sacred sign of something behind her, of God, because being in God's image. And so the human body, at least in the original creation, was created to be a sacred sign of God and his love. And that's a fundamental part of marriage, to see in our spouse and spousal love an image of God's love for the world. Okay, after Adam exults over the creation of Eve, we immediately find the institution of marriage. And the text adds this comment, therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. In this cleaving and in this one flesh created by marriage, we see the unitive vocation of marriage, right? That it unites the two into one, making of marriage a maximal friendship. That's actually, those are the words of St. Thomas Aquinas about marriage. A maximal friendship and a symbol of the union between God and man. And thus the marital act, the conjugal act, is a kind of sign, a physical sign of that union that is physical and spiritual. And so the fact that in marriage that the two become one spiritually and also physically, God blesses that with fruitfulness, so that the offspring are, as it were, the fruit of the union of the flesh of the parents, and also the fruit of their spiritual union, which continues, that union needs to continue precisely to serve as the home and the place in which the offspring are to be nurtured and raised. And so we see in this chapter 2 of Genesis, which at first sight people take often for a kind of legend or myth, we see a very deep teaching about the most profound nature of marriage. Right? And we see here all the fundamental elements that ought to govern marriage throughout all human history. So it's to be exclusive, as Adam and Eve's love was exclusive, there was no other. It's indissoluble, that idea that they become one flesh. It initiates an intimate union of life and self-giving, and it's ordered towards fruitfulness to the procreation of children. John Paul II, when he comments on this, he says that we see in these first, especially chapter 2 of Genesis, we see that man by his very nature is a spousal creature. In other words, he's ordered by his nature to the kind of mutual gift of self that is realized in marriage. Now, not everyone gets married, but everyone has that spousal vocation written into their nature, and it can be realized in different ways. Marriage is the natural way in which it's realized. Another supernatural way, we know, is celibacy for God's sake. And the single life can also, because why is that? Because in celibacy or virginity, for the sake of the kingdom of God, the human person becomes spouse of God. Right? And so man can realize his spousal nature in these two principal ways. In matrimony, but also being single for the sake of God's kingdom. So we see that the fact that man is made male and female, called to matrimony, is a kind of biological foundation for the fact that man is called to interpersonal communion. He's called to communion with others who complement him. Man's not self-sufficient. Right? He needs a helper, a complement, with whom he can receive but also give himself. Now, it might seem, after all of this, that the picture painted for us in the second chapter of Genesis is too ideal when we look out into the world. And, of course, the second chapter of Genesis was before the fall. And that's very important, that marriage was instituted before the fall. But it continues after the fall with the exact same properties. Nevertheless, because of the fall, marriage has become fragile and needs to be defended. Right? And in the garden, God gave to Adam and Eve, certain gifts that would protect marriage and sanctify it. And those gifts were lost through the original sin. And those gifts are fundamentally two. Adam and Eve were created with sanctifying grace, like we get at baptism. And they were also created with 4 preternatural gifts: immortality, freedom from suffering, some infused knowledge from God, and then finally, what theologians call the gift of integrity. Integrity meant the fact that the passions and emotions in Adam and Eve were in harmony with their reason and didn't rebel against their reason. That gift, we know, was lost. When Adam and Eve sinned, it was lost for them and for us. And so we come into this world without that gift called integrity, and so we experience that our emotions and passions rebel very frequently against what our reason dictates. And that marks human life. That makes possible lust and concupiscence. And so before the fall, marriage was protected by that preternatural gift of integrity, and even more so by sanctifying grace. And we see that in the fact that Adam and Eve were naked and were not ashamed. Right? That line shows us that the body didn't cause any disharmony to Adam and Eve, right, and to their passions and their emotions. But after the fall, they became aware of their nudity and were ashamed and hid themselves and made clothing. And so we see there the loss of that gift of integrity. Marriage remains very good after the fall, but it remains vulnerable to those passions which now become unruly. And so human history is a constant witness to the assaults of those passions, those unruly passions, lust principally, and other forms of selfishness, against the sanctity of marriage as it was created in the beginning. And so we see in human history, right from the beginning, polygamy coming in. Among the, we don't see it in Cain and Abel, but among the sons of Cain, we find polygamy first introduced. So the second, third generation. Yeah. And then divorce is the other plague that attacks marriage. And of course, adultery. Immodesty, promiscuity, etc. Lack of respect for children. The fact that abortion, even worse, infanticide, which was so common in the world outside of Israel, right? In the Roman Empire, in Greece. Infanticide, leaving an unwanted baby out in the wild to die naturally, that was an accepted practice. And before, outside of Israel and before Christianity. And that shows us the fragility of marriage in the face of the consequences of original sin. So given that, it's logical that the law, when it's given to Moses on Mount Sinai, would protect the family. And so we find that in various ways in the law of Moses. Now, just to review, in earlier talks, we divided the law of Moses into three parts. We said that the law of Moses, the principal part, is the moral law, the natural moral law that's given to us in the Ten Commandments. But the law of Moses also has two other parts, as it were. There's the ceremonial law, which gives laws of the liturgy, worship, and also ritual cleanness and uncleanness. For example, the laws regarding eating. And there are also laws regarding matrimony of that type. And then third, the law of Moses had certain judicial precepts, particular precepts with punishments and legal procedures. And so in all three of those parts of the law of Moses, we find legislation on marriage. We can't really go into it, we can just touch on it. But the key point is in the moral law, the natural moral law. We find three commandments protecting marriage. The fourth commandment, honor one's parents. The sixth and the ninth commandment, forbidding adultery and forbidding the coveting of our neighbor's wife. And so those belong to the natural law that's always valid, right? That Christ comes to fulfill. And we also find in the very first precept in Genesis chapter 1, be fruitful and multiply, again, that gives us a profound indication to the very nature of marriage, that by its nature it's ordered towards fruitfulness, fecundity, and populating the world. And that's a command given to the human race, to mankind as such, although not necessarily to each individual. And thus it's not surprising that in Orthodox Judaism, contraception or any anti-life practice was generally prohibited. The 6th and the 9th commandments are then strengthened by many particular precepts concerning modesty, purity, conduct, unchaste behavior. And these are of great importance in Orthodox Jewish family life, protecting the sanctity of the family, right, in terms of clothing, mixing the sex between the sexes. And then finally, the ceremonial law has a precept on marriage which prohibits sexual relations during the period of menstruation and a week thereafter. And this, in terms of practical life for Jewish people, is a very, certainly a burden, and what ends up happening in practice is the fact that they had to abstain during the unfertile period meant, of course, that it favored the fertility of marriage. And that belongs to the ceremonial law. It's not part of natural law, but it was a ceremonial law, again, to sanctify marriage and give it a connection to divine worship. Nevertheless, this beautiful treatment of marriage in the old law still has imperfections. Divorce is permitted, and we see that there's polygamy, especially at first among the patriarchs. Polygamy was practiced by the very wealthy, by the wealthy and powerful, the patriarchs and the kings, above all. We see King David, King Solomon, and above all, it was for the purpose of procreation, so that the lineage of the patriarchs and the kings would be broader. But nevertheless, it led to bad consequences. We see that above all with Solomon, it led Solomon into idolatry. Not directly, but he had many, many wives and many, many concubines, uncountable, 700 or something. And they were, for example, the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, and they had their own religion, and the wives asked Solomon to build altars to their gods on the high places of Israel, and Solomon did it to please them, bringing Israel into scandal, right? Favoring the practice of those false religions within Israel. And that was the cause of the splitting of the northern kingdoms, the 10 tribes of the north from Judah in the south after Solomon's death. Now, divorce, we see, it's legislated in the law of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 24, which says, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, if she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a bill of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house, she's no longer married to him." Right? So there's a procedure for divorce. And then there was a question of, well, what constitutes the motive for divorce? Deuteronomy says indecency in the spouse. And so one school of thought of the rabbis, the school of Shammai, gave it a strict interpretation, saying divorce was permissible only in the case of marital infidelity, in the case of adultery. But another school, that of Hillel, which prevailed, gave a broader interpretation. Any fault could be used as a motive for divorce. Nevertheless, the prophets chastised divorce as something extremely negative. We find a beautiful text from the prophet Malachi. This is in the 6th century after the Jews have returned from the Babylonian exile. And the people complained that God wasn't hearing their prayers and blessing them with prosperity, economic prosperity. And the prophet responds to them. He says, "You ask, why does he not hear us? Well, because the Lord was witness to the covenant between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. Has not the one God made you and sustained for us the spirit of life? And what does he desire? Godly offspring. So take heed to yourselves, and let none be faithless to the wife of his youth. For I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel." That's a beautiful text. I hate divorce. Now, the sanctity of marriage and the fact that it's properly monogamous, even though polygamy was permitted, and that it's properly indissoluble, even though divorce was permitted, that's shown to us above all in the fact that God himself uses the image of matrimony to be the sign or symbol of his relationship to Israel, which is, of course, exclusive, total, and irrevocable. Right? He doesn't admit of divorce on his part. And we see that in many texts. I've given you here two. A beautiful one is the prophet Hosea, chapter 2. God says to Israel, I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. And it's said in the future because it's speaking of the new covenant. Right? The new covenant is precisely that wedding between God and Israel, mankind. We see it also in Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 16. And this presents Israel as an adulterous wife that God first finds he finds her as a youth that's been abandoned. God washes her, cares for her, clothes her, puts on beautiful clothing, and it says, you grew exceedingly beautiful, came to regal estate. She was renowned for her beauty. And as the result, Israel played the harlot. The text is speaking of the religious infidelity of Israel. In other words, that she would then worship false gods. Adulterous wife who receives strangers instead of her husband. But at the end of the text, and it goes on and on, at the end of the text, though, it says that God forgives Israel despite her infidelities and says, I will remember my covenant with you in the days of your youth, God says, and I will establish with you an everlasting covenant. Then you will remember your ways and be ashamed when I take your sisters, both your elder and your younger, and give them to you as daughters. That's referring to the calling of the Gentiles. They're given to Israel as sisters when they come into the church. Anyway, let's go back to the text. I will give them to you as daughters, but not on account of the covenant with you. I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall know that I am the Lord, that you may remember and be confounded, and never open your mouth again because of your shame, when I forgive you all that you have done, says the Lord. So we see this text speaks of an everlasting covenant. And that's obviously the everlasting covenant inaugurated by Christ through the forgiveness of sins, by which he washes Israel and all mankind who enter in through baptism. He washes us of our sins and enables us to become members of his spouse, which is the church. Right? And so that's that eternal marriage covenant, perfected through the incarnation of Christ. Right? So now let's pass on to the New Testament and look at Christ's teaching on marriage. Now, Christ speaks of marriage in the Gospels principally in two places. And in both times he speaks of the indissolubility of marriage, the impossibility of divorce. The first time is on the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, it was said of, you have heard it said of old, but I say unto you. And so he does that with regard to marriage. He says, it was said to you of old, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say unto you, everyone who divorces his wife, except on grounds of unchastity, makes her an adulteress. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And then he repeated the same teaching, which would have been very shocking for his listeners, right? Because he's putting himself on the level of the legislator, and he's overruling Moses. Right? He's saying what Moses allowed is no longer allowed. And so the Pharisees come to him to question him about it. Right? They knew that he taught this, and they wanted to get grounds to accuse him before the Sanhedrin. And so they asked him, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And he said the same thing. But before that, he says, have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female? So that's Genesis chapter 1. And said, Genesis chapter 2, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one. So they are no longer two, but one. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. And they said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? And he said, for the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, in other words, the Garden of Eden, it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, what did Christ mean by that exception about unchastity there? Well, the Christian tradition has interpreted that to mean that in the case of adultery, separation is permitted. In other words, the innocent party, can ask for a separation on account of adultery. It's not, obviously, they don't have to ask for a separation. Better is to forgive the unfaithful party if that unfaithful party resolves, right, to not continue. But nevertheless, there was a right for separation, but they weren't permitted to remarry either one. Obviously, not the guilty party nor the innocent party. So the Christian tradition interpreted that text in that sense. And we find that, for example, in the Code of Canon Law. Okay, John Paul II, in his Theology of the Body, his Wednesday audiences, he returned to this text of, he made this basically the starting point of a year's worth of Wednesday audiences. And above all, it was Christ's reference to the beginning. So in Christ's answer to the Pharisees about divorce, Christ says, in the beginning it was not so. And before that he says, from the beginning God made them male and female. Right? So Christ makes a reference to Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And he shows that his intention is precisely to restore marriage to the sanctity that it had before the fall. Right? And he does this in different ways. On the one hand, he restores it by prohibiting divorce and polygamy. So he restores it to that original monogamous exclusive status that it had in Eden. In other words, he takes away from marriage anything that would be opposed to the very nature of marriage as a total mutual self-giving. Then secondly, Christ restores marriage to the beginning by being himself the perfect model of spousal love. And he does that by being the bridegroom. Now somebody might ask, well, how could he be the model of spousal love if he never married? Well, he came precisely to be the bridegroom of the church. Right? And so he shows us the perfect model of what spousal love should be, which means, of course, sacrificial love to the point of shedding your blood for the beloved. And then finally, but last but not least, through his paschal mystery, he merited for the church the grace to put into practice what he taught. In other words, he gives to spouses grace, and we'll look at that when we look at the sacrament of marriage, to live out marriage according to the original plan. Okay, so let's look first at the first aspect, that Christ restores marriage to its original indissolubility. And we see that in what he says, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. In other words, the nature of marriage comes from God, and it's not something left to human caprice or human will. It's up to our will to enter into it or not, but it's not up to our will to change its nature, because God is its author. And it also makes sense, because only a matrimony in which there's no possibility of divorce and remarriage can really be total and irrevocable self-giving. Why is that? Well, it's because the person to whom we marry is a person made in God's image, who, by that very fact, merits a total love. A love in adversity as well as prosperity. A love even when that person renders themselves less lovable or perhaps completely unlovable through sin. They're still a person made in God's image, and they merit a forgiveness and a love that knows no measure. Right? And that's the nature of conjugal love. As long as divorce, remarriage, or worse still, polygamy, are alternatives, remain as alternatives, as long as there's that possibility, the gift of self to one's spouse will never be total, because it doesn't involve giving one's entire future. Right? And so, by entering into marriage with the possibility of divorce, that really makes the full marital consent impossible, because it's a consent that is irrevocable. That's what it means to totally give oneself to another person. Okay. And secondly, only a marriage which is indissoluble and exclusive, only that can give the proper environment for the natural offspring of marriage, which is children. In other words, children, likewise being persons made in God's image, have the right to be raised in a family. In other words, in a stable family in which they're loved by two complements. In other words, by a paternal and a maternal love. Now, sometimes that may be impossible because of the death of one of the spouses. But nevertheless, they have the right to that from our point. In other words, if God takes the life of a spouse, that's one thing. But for the parents to withdraw from that environment voluntarily, children understand that's incompatible with the love that's somehow due to them. And finally, the indissolubility of marriage and the exclusiveness makes it possible for marriage to be an image and likeness of God's love for mankind, right? Because His love is total, irrevocable, and exclusive for each one of us. In other words, He loves each one with a total love. We can't do that, right? In other words, because of the limitation of man and our bodily nature, we can't love 10 billion people with a total love. If we give it to more than one, we're subtracting from the other, right, in terms of spousal love. And so only an exclusive and indissoluble love of the parents is able to represent God's love for His church or for Israel. Right? So for those three reasons, matrimony, by its very nature, has to be indissoluble and exclusive. In other words, not monogamous. For the sake of the mutual gift of the spouses, for the sake of the offspring, and so to serve as an image or sign of God's love for His people. And so those are the three fundamental reasons. And thus, it belongs to natural law, even though the nations didn't observe it. Right? Even though we find polygamy and divorce just about everywhere in human society, it still goes against natural law. It goes against the very nature of marriage. Okay, that's the first aspect. Secondly, Christ sanctified marriage by making it a sacrament. So let's look at that. Christ sanctified marriage not only by teaching about it, but through His acts. And it's not accidental that He begins His public ministry precisely at a wedding, the wedding at Cana. He does His first miracle through the intercession of Our Lady. But more importantly, He sanctified marriage precisely by through His incarnation. He is by nature the spouse of Israel. In other words, God is Israel's spouse. Christ made man, in other words, God made man, the Word made man, comes obviously to be the bridegroom for Israel and to call all mankind to that bridal feast, to the wedding feast, which we celebrate, by the way, in the Eucharist. Right? That's what the Eucharist is. And so Christ comes as the bridegroom, continuing that revelation that we saw before, by which marriage is an image of God's love for His people. And so, by coming as the bridegroom, Christ sanctifies marriage by making it a sacrament. And what that means is a sacred sign that effects what it signifies. A sacred sign of God's love, which communicates that love infallibly unless we pose an obstacle. Right? So the marital consent has been raised to a sacrament by Christ. And we see that explained by St. Paul in the letter to the Ephesians, chapter 5. St. Paul says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word," which is, of course, baptism, right? Having cleansed her by baptism, "that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing." In other words, having been made clean by the forgiveness of sins in baptism, "that she might be holy and without blemish. Even so, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, because they've been made one flesh. For no man ever hates his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, as Christ does the church, because we're members of his body." And then he quotes Genesis chapter 2. "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." This mystery is a profound one, and I'm saying it refers, and that word mystery there is the same as sacrament. Sacrament and mystery are synonyms. So you could say this sacrament is a profound one, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. And so we see there that St. Paul speaks of matrimony, that becoming one flesh, as a sacred sign, a sacrament, a mystery of Christ's union with his church. And what that means is that matrimony, for all Christians, for all those who have been baptized, in other words, through baptism we enter into Christ's life. Once we've entered into Christ's life, marriage becomes a sacrament, which means that the simple act of marital consent, valid marital consent of the two spouses, they're the ministers of the sacrament, right? The priest witnesses, but the ministers are the spouses. Their marital consent is raised to a sacrament and gives grace, gives precisely the grace to sanctify matrimony, to restore it to how it was at the beginning, in Eden. In other words, to restore it to the model of Christ's love for the church, that of perfect love, to the point of self-sacrifice. And so the sacrament of matrimony gives grace in two ways. It gives sanctifying grace, that stable, abiding friendship with God, from which charity flows, just like all the other sacraments. Hopefully a person who's married in the church already has sanctifying grace from baptism and from confession if they ever lost it. But matrimony gives an increase of sanctifying grace, and it also gives a title to a whole series of actual graces in order to sanctify married life in all the different occasions of married life, in all the difficulties and temptations of married life. Now, obviously, we can refuse to cooperate with those graces. We're free. But if we cooperate with them, God will give more graces. Right? And those graces concern all the aspects of family life, not just the marital union, but also sanctifying the children, educating the kids. In other words, bringing spousal, maternal, and paternal love to perfection. And it's a progressive thing. If we cooperate with the graces that we've been given, God gives more. Right? But if we fail to cooperate, well, then we're retreating. And so in this way, matrimony in the church is sanctified and made a path of holiness, right? Like the other vocations. Such as celibacy for the sake of the kingdom. Now, I thought, in the context of marriage, speaking about marriage, I thought I would speak also a little bit about the question of contraception, even though Christ doesn't directly speak about it in the New Testament. It's obviously part of the Christian tradition from the beginning. It's taught recently by Paul VI, the Humanae Vitae, and by John Paul II in many, many places. And it's deeply in harmony with everything that we've seen about the very nature of matrimony in the Old and the New Covenants. The key idea is this, that God wanted to give mankind a participation in his kingly act of creation. Right? And that, we said, was the reason why God instituted matrimony. To be the way that he instituted for mankind to participate in his proper activity, the creation of a new soul, of an immortal person, of a person with an immortal spiritual soul that lives forever. And we, spouses, can procreate. In other words, we can enter into that aspect of God's creative activity. But obviously he wants us to enter into it in a certain way, according to certain laws that respect the very nature of marriage and procreation. And so first and foremost, that participation with God in marriage is obviously something sacred. It's sacred because we're participating with the Creator in a way that we can't participate in anything else. And even the angels weren't given to participate in that way. Right? They participate greatly in God's work of governing the world, but they can't, in the creation of a new immortal being. Right? But the spouses can. And so that act of participation is obviously something sacred, and therefore needs to be kept from profanation or disorder. And a profanation or disorder would be using that act for a merely selfish purpose. In other words, separated completely from God's purpose in that act. It would also profane participating with God's creative activity to do the marital act without being outside of marriage, because in that case there wouldn't be the union for two reasons. The union between the ones doing the sexual act wouldn't reflect God's love for his people. It wouldn't be irrevocable and exclusive. And it wouldn't form the environment in which his love can grow. Obviously, the family. Now, God's love in creation is a reflection of his intertrinitarian love. In other words, God's creation, his work in creation, reflects the love that he has from all eternity in his own intertrinitarian life of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father and the Son is the fruit of the divine, eternal, intertrinitarian love of the Father and the Son. And God's will that marital love likewise have that fecundity, have that property of being fruitful. And so we see that God has put into matrimony two aspects, which theologians speak of as the unitive and the procreative aspects or dimensions. The procreative, obviously it's fruitful, but the unitive is that in the very act of being fruitful, the spouses are bound ever more closely as one flesh. And the key idea is that those two aspects can't be separated by human will. Because to separate them by the spouse's own through contraception would be, as it were, to close the door to God's participation in that act. It would be to... there's a great book by Fulton Sheen, Marriage Takes Three. Right? So in marriage as a whole, but especially in the marital act, it's not an act of two, but of three, because even if it's not the fertile period or if one of the spouses is barren, it's still by its very nature opened to God's entrance there through his creative power. And so to do contraception is, in a sense, to close the door to God's participation in it. It's saying you're not wanted. He has obviously the right to not make it fruitful, and of course it's not fruitful during the infertile period. But the spouses, to make it deliberately infertile would be, as it were, to exclude the Creator, and by doing so, they change the whole nature of the marital act. they take it out of the context of being something sacred. And so the result is inevitably a loss of the dignity of marriage and of the respect for one's own spouse. Right? Because the marital act shows such a respect precisely because it's an act that involves the Creator. And so removing the Creator from it will take away the reverence of the spouses for one another. And so it will gravely harm the marital union. So by depriving the marital act of its procreative aspect, the unitive aspect will also suffer. Right? Basically that was the teaching of Paul VI and John Paul II, that by depriving the marital act of its procreative power, the unitive aspect will also be impaired, and thus it will be tragic for the whole marriage. And here there's a beautiful harmony between the Catholic teaching on this and the Orthodox Jewish tradition. Rabbinical law doesn't completely ban contraception, but it's very rare and only possible after consultation, in rare cases after consultation with rabbinical authorities. And the reason for that is their deep respect for the procreative dimension of marriage as precisely God's will and His institution, as something sacred. The rabbinical tradition recognized that in the marital act there are 3 partners, right? And that's the exact same teaching as we find in the Catholic Church. Right? We can't simply close the door to God on our own initiative in the marital act. Okay, I'd like to close with a reflection on marriage and celibacy. It's not uncommon to hear that Jews misunderstand Catholic teaching on marriage by understanding it to be something negative. In other words, frequently they say that the Christian conception of marriage is more negative than the Jewish. And they cite celibacy as a manifestation of that negative view. In other words, they tend to think that we prize celibacy because we think marriage is intrinsically evil or bad or something that can be sanctioned but not holy in itself. And everything we've been saying up to now shows that that's obviously totally false. Right? The Catholic Church has always defended the sanctity of marriage, and one of the greatest problems in the history of the Church has been heretical groups that do the opposite, that say that marriage is not holy and is in fact intrinsically evil. The very first heresy that was a problem in the Church, called Gnosticism, was precisely that. They thought that the body was the cause of all evil, and therefore marriage in which new bodies are produced was evil. And in the first centuries, the first 2 or 3 centuries, that was the main opponent. And by the same reason, they didn't believe in the incarnation of Christ in His true humanity and the passion, because, again, of the fact that we're saved by the body and the suffering of the body. That heresy continued in different forms for many centuries. It became Manichaeism. St. Augustine, probably most of you know, was a Manichae for many years. It's the same basic heresy as Gnosticism. And then in the 13th century, it continued in Albigensianism in the and that's when the Inquisition was first formed, to combat Albigensianism. And the reason was because this heresy endangered civil society. If you say that matrimony is bad and evil and it's better to not to procreate, obviously society is gravely threatened. We see that happening today. Albigensianism went so far as to condone suicide and see it as something heroic, and to prefer homosexuality to heterosexuality precisely because homosexuality is not fertile. And so the Church, so often, for so many centuries, had to combat these kinds of heresies precisely by showing the sanctity of marriage. And we see the same thing today in the culture of death. It's really a revived form of that same basic heresy, a slightly different trapping. But people see the fruit of marriage, children, as an evil, something threatening the world, instead of as its greatest good. The very reason why God created the world, so that we could have immortal souls that could love God forever and ever in heaven. Okay. Now, but it's important to see that the appreciation of the church for celibacy and consecrated virginity in no way implies that marriage isn't something holy. On the contrary, consecrated celibacy is seen to be such an excellent state by the church precisely because it's a spousal relation. Consecrated celibacy is a spousal relation, an exclusive and irrevocable spousal relation with God. In other words, it's a kind of matrimony with God. And thus, it's the most holy state precisely because it's matrimony to the most holy one. If he calls, obviously. And at the same time, celibacy for the kingdom, or consecrated virginity, is not deprived of maternal and paternal fecundity. The whole purpose of consecrated celibacy is to have a spiritual fecundity. Right? In other words, to exercise spiritual maternity and paternity. So prizing celibacy for the sake of the kingdom in no way detracts from marriage, right? But should serve instead to exalt marriage. It's interesting that when Christ explained this vocation of the goodness of celibacy for the sake of the kingdom of God, it was precisely in the context, it came immediately after the question of the Pharisees on divorce. So he explains the indissolubility of marriage, and the reaction of the apostles is shock, amazement, and then they say, well, if that's true, if marriage isn't totally indissoluble, it seems like it would be better for man never to get married. And so Christ corrects them, because in other words, they're seeing marriage as something bad because of its indissolubility. Jesus he gently corrects them by showing that celibacy for the sake of the kingdom is a great good if one is called. Right? So he says this. The apostles say, if such is the case with a man with his wife, it's not expedient to marry. But Jesus said to them, not all men can receive the same, but only those to whom it is given. Right? It's a special vocation that God, who's free, can give to some, and he chooses not to give it to others. Right? And we have to be faithful to the vocation that he gives to us personally. For there are eunuchs, he says, who have been so from birth. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He who is able to receive this, let him receive it. Right? In other words, it's a special vocation from God to become a bride of Christ. The Vatican II speaks about this in Lumen Gentium and other places. And beautifully, it says, consecrated virginity, celibacy, is a precious gift of divine grace given by the Father to certain souls, whereby they may devote themselves to God alone the more easily due to an undivided heart. Right? And that's quoting St. Paul, the first letter to Corinthians, chapter 7. This perfect continency, out of a desire for the kingdom of heaven, has always been held in particular honor in the church. And the reason for this is that perfect continency for the love of God is an incentive to charity. In other words, it's a means, a tool or instrument for the development of charity and to be a source of spiritual fecundity in the world. In other words, it's an aid for spiritual maternity and paternity. And so the excellence of consecrated celibacy in no way denigrates marriage, but it acts as a sign of the future marriage in heaven that all of us hope for. Because in heaven, there will be no more giving and taking in marriage. Jesus speaks about that, again in the context of marriage, when he's asked by the Sadducees the question about the resurrection. Because the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. So they made up this complicated story about the woman who'd been married to 7 husbands. Who would she be the wife to in the resurrection? And Jesus takes that occasion to explain that in the resurrection, he says, those who are counted worthy to attain to the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. And so human marriage will not continue as an institution in the resurrection. And so it's interesting to ask us, well, why would that be? Right? Why would marriage not be a fitting state for man in heaven? Aren't we still made for interpersonal communion? Aren't we still spousal creatures? Don't our bodies still have that spousal character or meaning? And the answer is yes, of course. But that spousal character of the human being will be perfectly realized in matrimony with God in heaven. That's what heaven is all about. It's entering into the life of the Blessed Trinity in a spousal relationship, a filial and spousal relationship at the same time. See, matrimony here is a sacrament. In other words, a sacred sign of God's love. But the sacraments are only for this life. In heaven, there are no more sacraments because you see God face to face. A sacrament is a sign for this time in which we can't see God. And so in heaven, the sacraments and signs pass away because we have the reality. Right? And so everything that makes human marriage so beautiful, that complete gift of self, that self-sacrifice, that irrevocable union, that exclusiveness, that fruitfulness, all of that will be present in heaven in our relationship with God. And we won't need the mediation of matrimony with our human spouse, because we'll all be spouses of God. Right? And so that's why celibacy for the sake of the kingdom is so beautiful, because it's a sign of what we all hope to be here on earth. It's beautifully, this nuptial character, the spousal character of heaven, is beautifully revealed in the end of the book of Revelation of John, in the last chapter 21. His final vision, he says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. And I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling of God with men. He will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God will be with them. Right? So the heavenly Jerusalem is the bride, and Christ, or we could say the Holy Trinity, is the bridegroom. Now somebody might ask, well, okay, we'll all be spouses of God in heaven, but what about that horizontal dimension of interpersonal communion with other human beings? Will that not be present? Of course it will be present. That's the idea of the communion of saints. That in heaven, interpersonal communion among human beings, and also angels, will be perfected precisely by first having the fullness of communion with God. And so the communion of saints is the heavenly Jerusalem. The very beatitude of the heavenly Jerusalem is a beatitude that's spousal and fraternal at the same time. So on that note, we'll conclude.